you so much for agreeing to chat to us today.
And where are you?
I'm in Melbourne, Australia.
Nice. I've been to Melbourne. I love it. Wonderful place.
Yeah. oh, mate, this film, it just absolutely blew me away. It's an absolutely amazing film. Tell us a little bit about where the idea for this film first came from.
Well, thank you for saying that. The idea came a long time ago, honestly. I wrote the first draft of this script about 15 years ago. And so it's, to the best of my recollection, I think I was just reading about Edgar Allan Poe for no particular reason other than interest, and tripped across this interesting fact that he had been a cadet at West Point. And that intrigued me because it just seemed to be contrary to assumptions that I would have made, and probably anybody would have made. And so I investigated that a little bit further, and really very quickly figured out that any assumption about young Edgar Allan Poe is probably wrong, and that this guy was really interesting, from a standpoint of he was, you know, considered to be a sort of a handsome, well-spoken guy with leadership potential, and just not in any way what you'd think of Edgar Allan Poe. And so when I discovered that, I thought, okay, this is interesting. How did this guy become that figure that we all have in our minds, right?
Yeah.
And I decided, oh, what a good opportunity to tell a story.
Was it difficult to research that part of his life? Because, like you said, we looked at Poe's work when we were at university, but we were never taught anything about his early days and especially his time in the military. Was it difficult to research that part of his life?
Uh, well, there's stuff out there, for sure. It's not like it's completely unwritten, but certainly the fact that there are gaps, frankly, was good for me. Every gap is an opportunity for me to invent something, and there was definitely a gap in terms of the understanding of how the guy went from being best cadet at West Point, which he was for a short period of time, to court-martialed and leaving the institution. And I thought, oh, that's just so good. And, I was really delighted, to be honest, when there wasn't a clear answer what happened. Now I think I know what happened. I think you can figure it out, but because it's not definitive, for me that was the opportunity to tell a cool story. But in terms of what was difficult, I think more so than Poe, because again, I'm telling a fanciful story, right? I'm really not trying to tell the tale of what really happened in Edgar Allan Poe's life. But what was interesting to discover was that the year it set, 1830, was a bit difficult to research when I actually did the production of the film. It's a kind of an interesting gap, in the timeline where there's all kinds of world details that are hard to be sure about, because it's just really before photography becomes commonplace, or at least prevalent, right? That follows more in the Civil War, and so there was just a lot of detail that wasn't recorded, and I had to. It was a lot of fun. I had to go do some very cool research. If I wrote into the script, oh, they're drinking whiskey. This is an assumption I'm making, that they would have been drinking whiskey, but would they really have been drinking whiskey? for myself, I needed to find out. And
Yeah.
there's things like that. Oh, there's a wood stove in the cabin. Did they really have wood stoves in this year? And what would they have actually looked like? That kind of thing. And so it was more challenging to research 1830 than it was to research Edgar Allan Poe.
Okay, so we have a lot of young screenwriters and a lot of young filmmakers that listen to this show. Tell us a little bit about the script writing process, and how did you develop the circumstances that you've put Poe into in this film?
Okay, again, 15 years ago, and many scripts later, I can't be precise, but I knew that I set out early with this very simple notion of, okay, how does a bright, upstanding young man become a broken, addicted, sort of pallid, ghostly figure that we know? How does this happen? Okay, so in my fanciful tale, then I thought, okay, I'm going to seed the story with elements that would come out in his writing later. Yeah. So in effect, how did Poe become Poe? So then it was a lot of fun to go consider, well, what can now they call them Easter eggs, and what Easter eggs or what elements can I bring from his writing into this? And then the frame of it, was informed by the fact that he effectively invented detective fiction. And I thought, okay, that's great, a kind of procedural process is, that's a friend to a screenwriter. Now you kind of know how you can lay it all out. He's trying to get an answer to something, and along the way, a series of horrors will break him mentally and set him on a course for becoming who he was later. And additionally, then I was also concerned with, there are things we associate with Poe. Of course, it's the macabre writing. Then there's the addictions, the drink and all that. But there's also, the kind of the love sickness and his difficulty in that respect. And so thematically, I wanted to weave love into the narrative. So the thing really becomes a sort of a mashup of all of this, a bit of a detective procedural, kind of wrapped in a gothic horror.
Well, it works perfectly well. Like I said, I love the film. And you mentioned there that you wrote the script 15 years ago. Why was now the perfect time to make Raven's Hollow?
Yeah, 15 years ago or thereabouts, when I wrote the first iteration of it, wasn't very long after I finished it that another Edgar Allan Poe movie came out called Raven, with John Cusack. And nothing against that film at all, but it just didn't do well. And it was a different, environment in Los Angeles, and it kind of did harm to the name of Poe for a while. It was very clear after that film came out, no one was going to be interested in Poe for a while.
Yep.
And so that was part of it. It just that wasn't the right time, because that other film had kind of caused a problem. It wouldn't now. I don't think it would now. Look at how many iterations of Sherlock Holmes there are and all that. Yeah. But that's how it was then. And then the other thing was, I think the flavor, you've seen it, I think the flavor of horror was, not what was going at the time. It's a little more of the torture porn period, right? And this is a different kind of thing. This is a slow burn. And happily, films like, The Witch and Hereditary and some others I think really opened the door for the A24 stuff, particularly just says, oh, there's an audience for a different kind of horror. And so Poe was sort of rehabilitated, and the timing seemed to be right for my approach.
Yep.
That's how.
So the other big question that comes out of this film is, how do you cast an actor to play Edgar Allan Poe? Did you have any ideas going into this who you wanted to have play the part? And if not, when did William Moseley come onto the scene?
Right, that's a great question. Because initially, as I've said, my interest was, how does a guy who just really seems like, in essence, a classic leading man, become that image that we all know, right? Somebody who looks just a little bit off and disheveled, and we know they're kind of messed up. How do you make that journey? That's the inspiration. But then when you come to casting, okay, there's a great temptation. Suddenly there's a great temptation to cast Poe as an oddball, as an eccentric, right? Because listen, that's fun. That's interesting instantly. Oh man, he'll be a weirdo. And when I got into casting, this was the first thought was, okay, am I truly going to play this arc as I originally was inspired, or do I want to investigate something else, right? And ultimately, I just trusted my initial interest and decided to look for an actor who really is what Poe was in the time, young, good-looking, solid, respectful, and Will really fits that model very well. So I also knew William, just happened to be that I knew him, and I knew that he would go into the production giving me 110%, and I knew we were going to have a hard production. We were going to be filming in a place that could throw us some really difficult weather. There's some, as you know, some aggressive horse stuff, and it just physically was going to be challenging. And I needed a leading man who was up for that, who was ready to go into that kind of, under those conditions, and wasn't going to complain, and would dive in fully. And that's exactly what he did.
Exactly, yeah. Christopher, I know we're running out of time very, very quickly, but I had one question I wanted to ask. The atmosphere that you create with this film, I said in my review, it felt like a film that Poe would be proud of if he directed it. How did you go about creating that atmosphere, especially on set?
Well, okay, first of all, we were in COVID lockdown, and we were all living there. We were living in Ravens Hollow. And we were way out in the countryside. We were 40 some miles away from Riga. So it was just kind of eerie all by itself. And beyond that, it starts really with everybody dreaming the same dream. And I think whatever was on the page came through. I had cast appropriately. I really felt good about the cast. It's the best cast I've ever had. And I think we had a shared sensibility. And of course, it's my responsibility as the director to bring the cast into the tonality that I was looking for. But it honestly, it wasn't that difficult. They got it. They just kind of knew. And come on, you can't go wrong with Kate Dickie. Are you kidding me? She's just phenomenal. But David Heyman and really everybody. They were all able to just effortlessly step into that Gothic world. So, we had a really immersive set. We built a ton of that, and when you were in it, you were really in that town. You were in that place, so it helps.
Well, Christopher, thank you so much for taking the time to chat to us today. It's been an absolute honor having you on the show, and I can't wait to see what project you work on next.
Me too. But thank you so much.
No